Hi, my name is James Johnson, and I have the great joy of being the Chief Officer of Spiritual Development at Honey Lake Clinic, and I'm so grateful you've joined us for this class today on morality. Specifically, we're going to discuss how we measure morality. How do we go through this process of measuring systems of morality to determine good and evil in our culture that sadly is so often confusing and changing? Because there are a lot of voices that we hear, whether it's news, social media, friends, family, church, all of these places, these avenues that try to tell us what to believe about right and wrong and good and evil. And so, how can we do this in a systematic way that makes sense of reality and actually helps us to live resilient and full lives that can make sense of the world around us and the human experience? So, that's what we're going to discuss today. And I really appreciate you joining us. If you're a note taker and you want a copy of this presentation, I'm always glad to send anything I do to people that would like to have the presentations. My handwriting is really bad, so I don't like to use whiteboards or handwritten materials, so I've got a presentation for just about everything. And if you would like that, you can send me an email using the information on the screen, and I'm glad to send it to you, jjohnson@honeylakeclinic.com, and you're welcome to it. So let's talk a little bit about the struggles with morality. As I mentioned just a few moments ago, we have all of these voices that from the time we're born speak into our lives and try to help us make sense of the world. We have our parents or the families that raise us, whether that's the nuclear family or a adjusted family model. As we live in this postmodern society, the family is not what it once was. And so all these different structures, not to mention religious views, cultural views, and of course the things that we hear from the television and through this new thing that we call social media. And when I say new, I don't mean new as in new in our culture, but definitely new when it comes to the study of morality. That social media really has only been around for the last 30 or so years, and it's only been normalized within the last decade. The first smartphone as we think of it today as in like an iPhone came out in 2006. So we're not even 20 years removed from the first iPhone, but we can't deny the impact that our faith, our news outlets, our cultural beliefs, and social media has in determining what we believe as right and wrong. And one of the things we have to recognize is that in the two most recent generations, Generation Z and now Generation Alpha Alpha, they have not gone at any point in their life, at least here in the United States, without access to information on the internet at their fingertips, constantly available. As a millennial who was a teenager during the 90s, I remember how hard you had to work to get information. You had to go to the library. You had to use the Dewey Decimal System. The internet was available, but in computer labs, it really wasn't until my late teens, early 20s where the internet became readily available. But these two most recent generations have constantly had it, and as a result, there is no longer the same value on the expert. That so many studies have shown that the expert is no longer valued because with information being at our fingertips, everyone is an expert. I mean, think about talking to a young teen, early 20-year-old who goes to the doctor, gets a diagnosis for their medical condition. Most of them are not going to say, okay, the doctor told me, I believe it. Instead, they're going to go on the internet, they're going to do an internet search of their symptoms, and they're going to peruse articles and whether they're scholarly or not to try to figure out what do they believe about their symptoms. And they take into account what the expert says, but it's not the sole information source. So all of these things are meaningful, and we need to consider the fact that once upon a time, in American culture during the modern generation, which is what I grew up in the 80s, was the end of modernity, and into the end of the 80s into the 90s was the start of what we call the postmodern generation. But the modern generation was the last one to truly value the expert, and now we think everybody's an expert. And this causes issues when it comes to morality, because instead of going to our pastor or a priest or a minister or even a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist to understand this, everybody's an expert. So everybody's opinion matters, and that matters when we discuss this, because there are so many voices clamoring for attention saying they have truth. And so when we talk about this idea of truth, we have to recognize that truth is objective and it is measurable. That's why science works the way it does. Speaking of science, let's look at this idea: does culture change? This is a magazine article, commercial, ad, whatever you want to call it, from a nationally published newspaper from 1946. And in the 1940s into the 1950s, culture in the United States of America actually taught that cigarettes were healthy, that cigarette smoke was beneficial, that nicotine lowered stress, and that by taking time during the day to smoke a cigarette and to get off on your own, to get some of that stress out of your life, just take a deep pull, a deep drag from a Camel, because after all, Camel cigarettes are what doctors recommend most. And if you can see in the bottom of this newspaper, or excuse me, this magazine article, you can see these were celebrities of the time endorsing Camel cigarettes because more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Now, that was 1946. Flash forward almost 80 years, and what do we know now? Now, no doctor worth their salt would prescribe cigarettes as a therapeutic practice for stress. They would say, no, that's incredibly unhealthy. It causes lung cancer, throat cancer, oral cancers of all different shapes, forms, and fashions, and it creates dependency on nicotine and substance abuse. They would never say that. In fact, the opposite is what is happening now. So culture changes. And as culture changes, we have to recognize that along with it comes this view of morality. You see, according to the Barna Research Group and the Pew Research Center, 80% of Americans still claim to follow the Christian values. But the Barna Research Group actually has done studies that show that while 80% claim to be Christians, only 1 in 7 actually practice the faith. And so we've got this vast disparagement between what people say and what people do. And the culture of America has changed. And I'm not going to get into politics. That's not the point of this message, but in this class. But I do want you to understand that if you are basing your morality on culture, your morality is shifting faster than ever before. And in some ways, that's good. I'm thankful for a lot of the recognitions and understandings and changes that have been made in the last 50, 60, 80, 100 years in American culture. But we have to recognize that with this change also comes confusion. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to have an emotionally charged conversation with a young woman. And the military, I'm an Army chaplain in the Army Reserves, and so I have the joy of providing spiritual care here at Honey Lake, but also in the military setting. And one of the things that on the military uniform I wear as a Army chaplain, my religious affiliation is sewn onto my uniform, and that tells soldiers that I'm a chaplain, and it tells them what faith persuasion I am from. And so if somebody walks up to me, they're going to see that not only am I a chaplain, but I'm a Christian chaplain. And while that's still incredibly complicated because the umbrella of Christianity has a lot of different perspectives and views, it at least gives them a starting point. And so we were hanging out and had some downtime, and this young soldier in her early 20s comes up to me and she says, "How can you, as a Christian, be so judgmental of other people? What you're doing is wrong." And obviously she came out of the gate very emotional, very excited and full of her feelings towards this topic. And it kind of caught me by surprise, and thankfully this is not my first emotionally charged conversation. And so over time I have come up with a process that I do my best to follow. And my process has 3 components. When dealing with tough, emotionally charged conversations and controversial topics, I try to do 3 things every time. The first thing I try to do is be kind. I just try to be kind. My goal is not to have an argument or a debate. And I tell people that right out of the gate. So when she asked this conversation of me, I asked, can we sit down and talk about this? Because we were walking around standing. I said, can we talk about this? And so we found a place to sit down, and I told her my 3 rules. I said, if you want to have this conversation, I would love to do it. But I said, let's agree on some things. I said, first, can we agree to be kind to each other? And she smiled and she said, yeah, Chap, I think we can do that. Chap is short for chaplain. That's what a lot of people in the military call me. Chap, I think I can do that. I said, good, I think I can too. I said, can we be kind? Because I told her, I said, I've won a lot of arguments and lost a lot of friends. That you can win an argument and lose a friend. And I said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have an argument. I don't want to have a debate. I want to have a conversation. And I asked if we could do that. And she said, sure, let's do that, about this question that she had. And number 2, I said, can we agree to have an open mind? And I said, what I mean by that is I've been wrong a lot in my life. I've believed things that were untrue. And I shared with her what I just shared with you about the Camel cigarettes and doctors prescribing cigarettes. And I said, we've believed wrong things before in the past. I said, I have too. I said, so can we agree to have an open mind? That maybe I'm wrong, maybe you're right. And I said, maybe you're wrong and maybe I'm right about some things. Can we agree on that? And once again, she said, sure, let's do that. Let's agree that we are going to have an open mind to consider each other's perspectives. And I said, number 3, let's start by finding some common ground. Can we? And she said, sure, let's do that. So I asked her some questions as we found common ground. I said, do you believe that every human being is valuable, that all human life is valuable? And she said, yes, she did. I said, good, we found common ground. I asked her, I said, do you believe that there is right and wrong in the world? Are some things right to do and are some things wrong to do? And she once again agreed with me. I said, hey, we're 2 for 2. And I asked her one more question. I said, do you believe in good and evil? And she thought about it for a second, but she did. She agreed. She said, yes, I do believe that some things are good and some things are evil. And I said, look, we're off to a great start. Look at all this common ground we found. I said, you and I both believe that all human life is valuable, that we believe that all human life is precious. I said, when I look at you, I see a valuable human being. I said, hopefully when you look at me, you see a valuable human being that regardless of skin color, race, culture, language, creed, all of these things, these religious beliefs, that every human being has value. And we agreed on that. And I thought that was wonderful. So when we look at these 3 things, automatically we were on a good spot. I encourage you to do the same thing, because these conversations are not always easy to have. So we were able to do those 3 things. We were kind, we had an open mind, and we started with common ground. The 3rd question I asked her about good and evil was the one I wanted to start with our foundation with. And I said, when you talk about good and evil, what do you mean by that? And she told me some of the basic things, like there are some things in life that are right to do and some things are wrong to do. And what she was talking about, and what I was asking about, is morality. Morality is the right and wrong way to behave, believe, and understand concepts of good and evil. That's what morality is. Every person has a belief on morality, even if they believe that morality is a flawed construct. It's just an illusion, that there is no such thing as right and wrong. That's still a belief on morality. That atheism is still a religious belief, even if it's the belief in no religion. That immorality or amorality, a person that's amoral would say there is no such thing as morality. Well, that's still a belief on morality. And she and I both agreed we have a view on morality. That was what was charging her conversation. Now, the reason why morality matters is the way we measure morality determines how we live in and process the reality of the human experience. And she had a reality that she was living in, that she believed that there are people that are valuable to her that live a lifestyle that the classical teachings of Christianity disagrees with. The classical teachings of Christianity would look at that person's lifestyle and say that is wrong. It is not morally right to live that way. That God has a way that He's created that is the best way for us to live, and that lifestyle is against that and ultimately leads to harm, pain, and suffering in that person's life. And I told her that, and when we talked, she said, but who are you to judge? Aren't you judging them unfairly? And we had to talk about, because words have meaning. That's why we're talking about this. Words have meaning. And I asked her if it was okay to give a 7-year-old the keys to a car and say, go drive down to the grocery store and get us a gallon of milk. And she said, oh, no, 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 that would be wrong. That would not be smart at all. And I asked her why. She said, well, that 7-year-old is not mature enough physically or mentally to be able to drive the vehicle. And I told her, you just made a judgment. And the reason why I use that example, and she laughed and she agreed with me. She said, you're right, I did make a judgment. I said, but we have to understand the difference between judgment and condemnation. When I go to buy a new car, I have to make judgments. I have to say, is this car in my price range? Should I buy a new car or a used car? Is this vehicle type going to fit the needs of my family? Can I afford the monthly payment? Do I need, can I afford insurance? All of these things are questions I make in a judgment about whether or not I should buy that car or not. Those are judgments. I said, but what you're talking about is not a judgment, it's condemnation. And I said, you know what, you're absolutely right. No human being has the right to look at another human being and condemn them because of their actions and say, you are less valuable than me because of what you've done or the way you live. And I said, you're absolutely right. And I apologized on behalf of Christianity, because Christianity has condemned people in the past. Whether it's the Crusades, the Inquisition, the slave trade in the Americas. I mean, all of these things where we looked at another human being and said, you are less valuable than me. That is wrong. But we have to, in modern societies, and especially in postmodern societies, we have to make judgments. We have to look at somebody who breaks a law and says, you broke this law, this is the punishment. That's the judgment. When we go to decide what meals we're going to eat or not eat, the way we're going to live our lives, those are all judgments we make. And we found common ground once again to say there's a difference between a judgment and condemnation. And I said that what Christians are supposed to do is we're supposed to look at another human being and say, you are of priceless value, but the way you're living is not God's best for you. That's a judgment. It's not a condemnation, it's a judgment. And so when Jesus says don't judge, the context of what we translate the word judge is the idea of condemnation. Because if you read the rest of that passage from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, also in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, we see that Jesus is telling us how to make judgments of what's right and what's wrong, how to do one thing and not do another. So he's not talking about judgment as in right or wrong. He's talking about condemnation in that context. And that helped she and I in this charged conversation understand that things change over time. One of the questions that I would ask my students when I was a high school teacher is I would ask them, if you found a bag of cash with $100,000 worth of cash in on the side of the road, what would you do? When I first started teaching, it was about 50-50. Half of the class would say, I would keep it. Finders keepers, losers weepers, as we used to say when we were kids. And the other half would say, no, that's not my money. If I took that money that's not mine, that would be wrong. I need to take that to the police. I taught in the classroom in public school for 17 years. At the end of my time teaching, and I asked that question, almost every single student said they would keep the money. When I work with adults, I ask the question a little bit differently. I say, if you had an anonymous bank transaction that deposited $1 million into your checking account, what would you do? Now we end up with a different set of problems. Some of them will say, I don't want to get caught, so I'm going to notify the bank. Some of them say, I'm going to completely withdraw and clean out my account and make a run for the border. Some of them say, I'm just going to live with it and say, oh, that it was anonymous. Somebody gave that money to me. And I'm going to just live and enjoy that money, and tons of other answers. But then I get a little bit more serious with them and ask them a little bit more of an emotional question. And ask them, what would you do if you saw a high school student beating up an 8-year-old on the playground or the bus stop in the backyard of the neighborhood, whatever? If you saw a high school student beating up an 8-year-old who could not defend themselves, I mean, this is a teenager versus an 8-year-old. What do you do? This is a moral issue. All three of these questions are moral issues, but this one sinks in a little bit more because we start seeing evil face to face. It is wrong for someone to hurt another person for no reason. It is wrong for a person to abuse their power, to bully and harm somebody else. And so we recognize this feeling of morality and of judgment calls that we're making regarding morality, and all of these are connected to our worldview. And we've discussed this more in depth. If you want to dig deeper into this, I encourage you to find the lesson on identity, and we talk more about this. But we have to recognize that every single one of us, every single person that has a rational mind that is developed in thinking, I recognize there are some people that have mental illnesses and mental disabilities that keep them from this. But on the norm, most of us have a worldview. And our worldview is exactly that. It's how we view the world. It's how we define our values and experience the events of life. We develop our worldview by answering 4 questions. We call those questions the ontological questions. Ontology is the study of meaning and purpose and existence. So for a human being to understand their purpose, their meaning of their life, they have to answer these 4 questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. The way we answer these questions determines whether we go down and live a life of an Adolf Hitler or live the life of a Mother Teresa or something in between or something radically different. Origin asks the question, where did everything come from? When I look at life, the universe, and everything, where did it all come from? Einstein was able to scientifically establish that the universe is expanding and that it had a starting point in history, that the universe is not infinite and doesn't exist for all time in the past and will exist for all time in the future. It is expanding. So where did it come from? Where did it start? Where did everything come from? Origin. Meaning, what's the purpose of my life? Am I here to live 60, 70, 80 years and die? Do I get the most toys and have the most fun, or is there something deeper than that? Morality, and this is what we're focusing on, who determines what is right and wrong? Is it my culture? Is it my family? Is it myself? Is it God? Who determines that? And lastly, destiny. What happens when I die? The way you answer these 4 questions determines the way you view the world. So for example, if you believe that life is meaningless and purposeless, and when you see a child starving in Sudan or in the Middle East or in your the neighborhood behind you, you say, oh, life is meaningless and purposeless, and it doesn't matter if that child starves to death. But if you believe that life is valuable and all life is precious, and we need to wrestle with the fact that why do people born in one country have life so hard, and another family born in a different culture and country have it so easy? We have to wrestle with these concepts. Why? Because these things filter into each other like dominoes. Our worldview, the moral law of right and wrong, and our thoughts and our inside of ourselves filters into and dominoes into our values. The way we actually believe the world is supposed to exist. What are our things we will compromise on and our non-negotiables? And that dominoes into our ethics, how we actually live our lives. These things domino into each other. And so the way I view the world influences and informs my values, which then determines how I actually live my life, what actions I take. How do I respond to the bag of cash I find on the side of the road? How do I respond to the banking error in the deposit into my checking account? How do I respond to the high school bully beating up that young child? How do I respond? How do I live my life? All of this matters. To muddy the water even more, though, is something called ethical fading. Because in our society, we recognize that everything's not clear. Everything is not seen by everybody. Everything's not in the light. Some things are done in secret. Some things are done where nobody else can tell. That's why finding the bag of money on the side of the road is very different from the child getting beat up, because who's seeing it? If nobody sees me find the money, that's different than me seeing the bully, because now I've seen it, I have to do something about it. Visibility matters. That's why the checking account question is a little different, because now there's oversight, that there's going to be somebody looking at my banking account and paying attention to those transactions. The further we get away from punishment, the more likely we are to compromise our values. That's called ethical fading. And we need to pay attention to that, because whether it's internet piracy where we download movies and watch them without paying for them, whether that's breaking the speed limit, whether that's finding the bag of cash on the side of the road, all of these things matter. So if we want to create a system of morality that actually makes sense, it needs to have 5 things. These 5 things. If we're going to measure morality, if it's going to actually work, it has to be mutual, it has to be meaningful, it has to be modern, it has to be measurable, and it has to be moored. Now, please forgive me. The English teacher and the minister in me love for things to either start with the same letter or rhyme. So all of these are M's. To measure morality, we need these 5 M's. And we're going to talk about them. If you don't like the M's, change it to another word, but as long as the meaning is the same, that's what matters. So let's look at what these 5 things are. Now, here's what I believe, and you can tell that if you are talking to me, I've already told you I'm a Christian. I believe in the Christian values. But even if you're listening to this and you say, James, I'm not a Christ follower, I don't believe in the Christian faith, that's okay. You still have to find a system of morality that meets these 5 things. But I am going to give you the caveat. In my years of studies, decades of study, of world religion, of philosophy, morality, ethics, only the Christian system meets all 5 of these. And we're going to talk about why as we go. I'm giving you that. So if you say, James, I don't believe in the Christian view of morality, that's okay, but you're going to have to compromise somewhere. Only the Christian view of morality actually meets all 5 of these. So let's work on that. Let's start with the first one. First, morality must be mutual. What do I mean by that? It means that it has to apply equally. When I sat down with that young woman to discuss this, I wanted to find common ground because I wanted her to understand that morality is mutual. It has to impact all of us. If morality only applies to people in Africa, but it doesn't apply to people in Mexico, we've got a problem. It's not true morality. That's just culture. Because you see, just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right or wrong, because different countries have different laws. It has to be mutual. That if you were to go to Tibet, and please forgive me, I know this is sad, but last time I looked, and I need to double check, but as of 2 years ago, the last time I looked, the nation of Tibet does not have any laws regarding age limits for consent when it comes to physical intimacy. That it is perfectly legal for a child in the single digits to be physically intimate with an adult who is 20, 30, 40, 50 and older. It's perfectly legal. And in fact, many people will travel to Tibet because, I'm sorry, not Tibet, Taiwan. Please forgive me. Taiwan was the country. That in Taiwan, there's no legal law, code that says age limit for the age of consent when it comes to physical intimacy and sex. And so people will fly to Taiwan to be sexually active with people that would be illegal in their country. And so if the laws change, does that make it morally okay? No. Morality has to be mutual. It has to apply equally to all people in all situations. It's just as wrong for an adult to be physically intimate with a child in America as it is in Taiwan, regardless of what the legal code says. That's why morality must be mutual. But not only does morality have to be mutual, it has to be meaningful. I was thinking about this the other day because one of my Army buddies asked the question and I was kind of chewing on it. This idea that why are there lifeguards in the Olympics for the swimming events? These are professional swimmers. They swim all day, pretty much every day, for their living. They are professional athletes when it comes to the water. Why do they have lifeguards? That's meaningless. So it seems, until an accident happens. And you see, once an accident happens, let's say a high diver misses the edge and hits their head on the concrete. Don't you want a lifeguard who is trained to be able to jump into that water and rescue that person and provide physical aid and medical assistance to them to save their life? Of course you do. So it must be meaningful. And while that idea of a lifeguard at the Olympics is not meaningful to me right now, it is still meaningful to the person that is in the pool doing those things. And so a proper system actually has to apply and impact a person's life. And this is why we need to talk about morality, because morality matters. The way we view morality impacts the way we live our lives. And so when we talk about these issues, it has to matter and impact a person's life. What do we say about things like abortion? What do we say about things like same-sex relationships? What do we say about the transgender situation that we've got going? What do we say when it comes to child poverty? What do we say when it comes to international relationships with our military? All of these things deal with morality at the basis, at the core, and it has to be meaningful. It doesn't matter if I'm talking about morality, and if it doesn't impact somebody's life, they don't care. The reason why that young woman was so emotionally charged when she accosted me about why Christians are so condemning of people who disagree with them was because that was meaningful to her. She had people that she loved and cared about, that a person who believed in the classical teachings of Christianity would say their lifestyle is immoral and it's wrong, based off the classical teachings of Christianity. And so it's meaningful. This is why it's important for us to not just learn these things, but also learn how to apply them well. It has to be meaningful. Now, this is where we start getting a little deeper. Morality also has to be modern. We have to talk about how we apply these things in a modern setting. When I was a young teenager going to church, we were taught how to share our faith. We actually were trained on this. We were going to go on a mission trip where we were going to go to meet with people who were not Christians, and we wanted to be able to share our faith with them in a clear and meaningful way. And so we took classes on it, but guess where we started? We started with the Bible. Because in the modern generation, my generation, people still believe the Bible was God's word. And so you could sit there and talk to somebody. People had respect for the Bible. And if I was going to tell them about the Christian faith and how morality works, I could start with the Bible. But guess what? Over the last 30 to 40 years, that has changed. The postmodern generation doesn't care about the Bible the way I care about the Bible. They don't put it on an elevated footing or platform. They compare it equally to every other book, whether it's a religious book or not. And so I can't start with the Bible when it comes to morality. I have to be able to talk to them in a way that makes sense for their values. This is a picture of Times Square in New York City. One of them, the top one, is in the 1960s, and the bottom one is in the 2020s. 60-year time difference. Has a lot changed in the last 60 years in our country? You better believe it, for good and bad. And so you have to be able to discuss how morality applies today, not how did it apply 60 years ago. We're not dealing with issues like the Vietnam War, but maybe we are dealing with the war in Ukraine, or as of this recording, the conflict in the Gaza Strip right now. How do we have to be able to put these in modern context? It has to apply to people in their current situations. So it has to be modernized. It doesn't mean it's changed. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying morality has to change. I'm saying the way we talk about it has to change. We have to be willing to have these hard conversations with people. And we have to be able to help them apply it in their life today, not the way that we would 60 years ago. Fourthly, morality must be measurable. And this is where we start to get even into the deeper waters. Not only does it have to be modern, it has to be measurable. Normally in a class like this, I will ask people in the classroom to tell me how big they think the room is. And at Honey Lake, the classroom we use is a pretty large one, so I usually get guesses that people make. They'll guess that it's 40 by 25 or 30 by 50 or something in that area. And then I'll have them tell me how tall am I? I'll stand up in front of the class and I'll say, how tall am I? And they'll say, oh, 6'2", 6'3", 5'11", whatever. They'll give me all of these guesses. Well, guess what they're going based off of? They're going based off their feelings. They're making a guess. And I say, if you want to know exactly how tall I am or exactly what the dimensions of this room are, what do you need? You need a system of measurement that is consistent. A proper system of morality has to have a standard that can be used in a clear way. And this is where my friend and I that were having this conversation began to get a little bit more serious. We were kind of having fun talking about and joking about things, but I had to ask her, I said, how are you measuring morality, right and wrong, good and evil? I said, obviously you're upset at what you see as Christians saying that your friends' lifestyles are wrong. What system are you using to measure? You see, if I want to measure the dimensions of a room, I can get a tape measure out and measure in feet and inches is kind of our American way of measuring width and length. If I want to measure how tall I am, I'd pull the tape measure out and you'd find out I'm 6 foot even, 72 inches. How do I know that? I have to have a system of measurement that is standardized, that it is consistent, and it does not change. How weird would it be if, when I went to go buy gas today, we used dollars, but if I came back tomorrow, we used yen, and then later that day we switched from yen to rupees, and then the next day we switched from rupees to pounds, and from pounds to euros. I mean, what if it was just constantly shifting the measurement? I'd never know how much gas is. I wouldn't know how to pay for it. What's the standard? The standard keeps changing. And so we have to recognize that morality has to be measurable. I have to be able to walk up and have a standard for how I measure it out as far as right and wrong goes. And what she began to recognize was that her standard was not measurable consistently. Because it also needs, not only does it have to be measurable, here's the hardest part. And this is where every other system fails. Not only is it measurable, morality must also be moored. To moor something means to anchor it. If you moor a boat, right? If you cast mooring lines, it's the naval term, you're tying it to the dock so that it doesn't move. It has to be fixed. Morality must have a fixed point of reference. Think about a compass. Why do compasses matter? Because compasses are consistent. You can measure it, but you can also trust that it's going to be moored. It is anchored. It is consistent. It is unchanging. A proper system of morality must be fixed. In studies of ethics, we call this the fixed point of reference. If I base my morality on culture, culture changes. We've seen that. Just 60 years ago, cigarettes were actually advocated and prescribed by doctors. 80 years ago, excuse me. Not too long ago, before that, we believed the earth was flat. Not too long before that, we believed that the earth was the center of the universe. Things change in culture. There was a point in time where it was illegal in the United States for people of different cultures to marry. Thank God we've changed that law. Once upon a time, it was legal to own another human being as property. Thank God we've changed those laws. Even though the law said it was okay, we can pretty much universally agree that it was wrong to own another human being as property. Why? Because morals transcend culture. Morals transcend the legal system. So what do we have to do? We have to find a system that has all 5 of those things. And I asked her, going back to the conversation, I said, let's say you and I were walking in the woods and we wandered off the path. We were just having a good time talking, and we quit paying attention to the path and we wandered off into the woods and we got lost. I said, how do we get back? Well, if we use the stars, do the stars move? Yes. Stars change over time. Over a long time, sure, but they still change. Do we use, what we call a fixed point of reference, or we call it a terrain association, is the term. I compare that water tower, that oak tree, that building. Is terrain association the best way to navigate? Well, in the short term, sure. Then in the long term, buildings can be demolished. Water towers can be taken down. Trees can be chopped down. So things change even in our surroundings. Have the surroundings of our American culture changed? You better believe it. Just in the last 5 years, think of what has changed in the last 5 years. Or some of us remember getting on an airplane prior to the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001. It was radically different. What's it like now to travel post-COVID, post the coronavirus? Man, the world has changed. So some of the things that we think are consistent, man, they get torn down. So we have to use something that is fixed. So I asked her, how would we get back? What's the best way? She said, a compass. Yes. I said, because without the compass, what do we go by? our feelings. And she recognized, I asked her, how are you making your judgments when it comes to morality? I said, you're upset at me using the Bible and the Christian faith. And I said, that's okay if you're upset about that. But I asked her, can we agree that the Bible is at least a fixed point of reference? When it's understood in its proper context and taught appropriately, is the Bible a fixed point of reference? And she agreed. The classical teachings of the Christian faith have not changed for 2,000 years. And so I asked her, I said, can we agree that's a fixed point of reference? And she said, that's right. I said, what about how you're judging? And she admitted after a while, she sat in silence for a couple of minutes, and I just let her think about it and reflect. But after a couple of minutes, she came back to the conversation. She looked up at me again, and she said, I'm going based off my feelings. And I asked her, if we were lost in the woods, would following our feelings be helpful or harmful? And she said, no, it would just get us more lost. Because she was a soldier, is a soldier, and so she understood one of the things we're taught in land navigation skills is if you go based off your feelings, we all drift to our dominant side. I'm left-handed. I drift to the left. If I don't constantly keep an eye on my compass, I'm going to drift to the left. And if I'm not careful over a long period of time, I'm going to make big circles. And I'm going to feel like I'm getting somewhere, but I'm just going in circles. And I told her our feelings do the same thing to us. That feelings are wonderful gauges, but they're terrible guides. They give us information, but they should never lead us. And I told her this truth, this principle. Feelings balanced with reality lead us to truth. And I asked her, I said, your feelings about your friends' lifestyles, are they anchored in reality or in what you want reality to be? And she had to admit that they're based purely on her feelings. That's why I said, you're welcome to your feelings. Feelings give you information. I said, you don't have to agree with the Christian point of view. But she was attacking the Christian view of morality, and she was able at the end to see that the Christian worldview balances feelings with reality. That we balance the way we feel about the world with the reality of what God's Word said to ultimately lead us to truth. So when I looked at her and I said, hey, your friends are valuable, but God's created a way for them to live that they're not living that's going to ultimately not be their best. And I used this example. I said, brushing your teeth. Is that right or wrong? Should you brush your teeth or not? And she said, well, of course you should brush your teeth. I said, but do you always feel like brushing your teeth? I said, what if you're laying in bed and it's late at night and you've had a long day of work and you're dozing off in bed, you've been watching TV in bed, and you're starting to fall asleep, but you know you haven't brushed your teeth yet before you went to bed that night. Do you feel like brushing your teeth? And she said, of course not. I said, no, I wouldn't either. But what do I have to balance my feelings with? Reality. The reality is that if I don't brush my teeth, that while it may not be a big problem at first, over time, plaque is going to build up and cavities are going to be created, and my teeth will slowly rot away in my head. That's the truth. I said, so I have to balance my feelings with reality. What's the truth? The truth was, regardless of how sleepy I was, get up and brush your teeth. Why? Because that's what truth is. And so I was able to help her recognize that she did not have a fixed point of reference in her morality. Her morality was based off her feelings. Now here's the cool thing. During this entire conversation, during this entire class, while I've referenced the Christian worldview, have I brought up a single Bible passage? Have I brought up a single verse of Scripture? No. And the goal of this class is not to convert you to Christianity. If you want to talk about that, let's have a great conversation another time. You can reach out. You've got my contact information. I'm going to put it back here on the screen in a second. But what I do want you to see is morality must have these 5 things in order for it to be a firm, established, true system, for it to work the way it's supposed to. And hey, I'm open-minded. I might be wrong. I'm willing to consider other evidences, but only the Christian worldview makes sense of these 5 things in a way that makes sense of the world and balances feelings with reality to lead us to truth. And so at the end of our conversation, we gave each other a high five. And guys, listen, I've done a lot of bad conversations. I've messed up a lot of times in the past. That's one example out of many conversations that actually went well. That's why I use it as an example. But my hope is that you will use this to reflect on your life and say, is the way I'm understanding morality and believing about right and wrong, good and evil, does it have these 5 things? And if it's missing it, how do I fix it? I'd also love to have a follow-up conversation with you about the Christian worldview and how it answers these. If you don't want to have a conversation with me about it, I encourage you to check out the video we have on the class on identity, because that goes deeper in it as well. And maybe then you'd want to have a conversation with me. But if you are a Christ follower and you want to have conversations with people, these are great ways to help them look at morality without forcing the faith on them. To say, listen, I'm not telling you what to believe, but I want to ask you why you believe what you believe. That if we want to measure morality and make sense of it, it has to have these 5 things. It has to be mutual. It has to apply to everyone. It has to be meaningful. It has to apply in our lives in a way that actually impacts us. Number 3, it has to be modern. It has to answer the questions of our current generation, not past generations. Number 4, it has to be measurable. It has to be fixed. It has to be something that I can go to every time and it doesn't change. It has to be moored. It's not going to drift and go away depending on what culture says or what the tradition says or what my feelings say. It has to be anchored in and not move like a compass. It has to have these 5 things. So as we've looked at this, I pray this has been helpful. If you're an academic person like me and you want to check out the sources, these are the sources I pulled this information from, because even though I've studied it and I have anecdotal and practical knowledge of this topic, I also want to be a good student and a good academic and provide you with some good sources as well. So once again, my name is Dr. James Johnson, and I'm so thankful that you've spent time with me today discussing this idea of morality and how we measure it. If you want to reach out and talk to me in the words of the great philosopher Kim Possible, call me, beat me if you want to reach me. I would absolutely love to discuss this more in depth to either help you process it or to help you find ways to utilize this in your life to help have healthy conversations with other people that lead them to life and health and wellness, that leads them to truth, and ultimately, I believe by leading people to truth, will also lead them to Jesus, because Jesus is the truth. So thank you for joining me. I pray blessings on your life. Thank you for joining us.